Right here. Okay, give me a second.
Are we doing the next panel? I'm staying. Yeah, okay. Just hang out.
So, and if we could have our third panel come up, the third panel will cover the rise of payments, mobile payments. So we welcome again Stephanie Erickson, VP of Risk Products for Visa, Thomas Brown, lecturer of UC Berkeley School of Law and partner at Paul Hastings.
Good afternoon, Chairman.
Thank you.
Members. So I guess I'll start. I'm Tom Brown. I'm appearing today in my academic capacity. And it's sort of I had no idea we were going to start the day with a discussion of a return to the 90s. It's always interesting to hear people fight about tomorrow. Don't often hear people fight about what was happening in 1996. EMV is not exactly a step forward in terms of technology with respect to payment. So hopefully I can help transition the discussion to things that we'll see going forward, though it is a very interesting issue, and one that I actually cover in my class at Berkeley with the students. So happy to answer questions on it, even if I won't address it in what I intend to discuss. I'm here today to talk about mobile payments, the effort to change the infrastructure that initiates payments at the point of sale from card-based transactions or paper-based transactions, which have respectively been around, in the case of paper, for literally thousands of years. It's an effective, cheap, and reasonably secure form of mobile payment. Indeed, it is so effective that it might be the most effective product that was ever developed in the history of man, right? So our ancestors developed that technology quite literally 5,500 years ago, and we continue to use it. Both the paper-based forms of payment as an alternative to metal and barter probably emerged simultaneously in Egypt and China around 3500 BC. Card-based payments are more recent. Sears was probably the first major issuer of cards in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The mag stripe that we see on the back is technology that was first developed in the 50s. It was implemented on payment cards beginning in the late 60s, early 70s. Chip and pin, as we heard about earlier, was developed in the 90s. This, of course, is newer. Interestingly, this is not something that existed in 1996 when the EMV standard was developed. Indeed, some would say that Al Gore hadn't even quite developed the Internet in 1996. The Internet only began to open to commercial traffic in 94, and brands that we now think of as synonymous with e-commerce, Amazon, Google, Apple, didn't have an e-commerce presence. One thing that was interesting that happened in 1996 is that Steve Jobs actually returned to his company. Apple bought Next in 96, just to help sort of anchor the discussion of technology. But of course, today we look forward to a world in which we won't have to use plastic or magnetic stripe to initiate a transaction at the point of sale. We've seen, of course, over the course of the last year, the development, introduction of things like Apple Pay, which at least hint at a future in which consumers can present themselves and introduce themselves without having to produce a separate plastic token to initiate the transaction. Unfortunately, though, our efforts to introduce true mobile payments are sort of hamstrung by the existing technological infrastructure and the existing rule sets around which all of these payment forms have to be built. So to the extent that you're looking forward to a revolution in how payments take place, my suggestion is that a bit like the 70s bumper sticker, which said that the revolution will not be televised, the mobile payments revolution will likely not happen in the first instance at the brick and mortar point of sale. We will see merchants, financial institutions, and others develop and deploy technologies in environments to create new experiences, and that those will over time migrate and change how we interact with the people who sell us goods and services, but we shouldn't expect any time in the near future to take out our phones and wave them Harry Potter-like at the point of sale before walking out of the store en masse. But nevertheless, things like Apple Pay have been major industry developments, and Google, with its acquisition of a consortium that had an unfortunate name that was once shared in common with the terrorist group operating out of northern Syria, was eventually renamed Softcard. That purchase seems directly tied to Apple's introduction of Apple Pay. And we can expect other acquisitions to come down the pike. On the regulatory side, since that's something that this committee is deeply responsible for and something I think that it has done an admirable job of discharging its duty with respect to, the mobile payments and payments landscape generally remain a quite interesting one in which to practice and a difficult one to teach because they are incredibly complicated. We have a regulatory structure at the federal level and a regulatory structure at the state level, and there are important differences in how we treat the kinds of providers that are providing payment solutions to consumers and merchants depending on the underlying nature of the institution. So my alma mater, Visa, for example, although it clears something on the order in the US last year of $3 trillion in notational transactional activity, not regulated. It serves to clear and settle transactions between financial institutions like JP Morgan and others who have bank charters and are themselves regulated, but institutions like Visa are not. They do not hold, for example, money transmission licenses. They are not banks. On the other hand, you have institutions like PayPal, which clear and settle many fewer transactions, but do hold money transmitters on a state-by-state basis. There have been some interesting regulatory developments in this regard, some effort to create a more rational structure with respect to the regulation of mobile payments. This committee, of course, amended the California Money Transmission Act in a way that I think streamlines its application. There's a bank charter that's being experimented with in Georgia known as the Merchant Acquirer Limited Participant Charter that enables non-traditional financial institutions to connect directly to institutions like Visa and MasterCard. There's now a single MALP institution that has received its charter from the Georgia Banking Department, a company called Credirax, which is what I would think of as a second-generation payment processor akin to First Data, based originally in Malta, operating out of Massachusetts, and now with a bank charter for a limited purpose in Georgia, and something that I think that our own Department of Business Oversight might look to as a potential inspiration. Speaking of potential inspiration, let me turn next to the issue of virtual currency, which I'm sure, which I know occupies a little bit of the committee's agenda, and I know I'm not speaking specifically on the issue, but it relates so intimately to the issue of payments generally and where payments are headed, that some of us who work deeply in this space sort of look forward to a day when we can replace the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s era technology that's currently implemented to initiate payments with something that is more organically born of the digital age. Things like the blockchain, things like Ripple's open ledger create the possibility for more efficient connection between the consumer and the merchant endpoint for a given transaction, and do not necessarily require the same infrastructure or connectivity that a bank network provides. It is not obvious, to say the very least, why in 2014, when everything is connected to the internet, that I have to provide information that my bank has given to me to a merchant to route it to a private network, to route it back to the bank, to provide permission for me to leave the store with whatever it is that I have chosen. And things like the blockchain and Ripple at least hint at a future where all of those endpoints can be more directly connected in much the same way that the internet eventually made it possible for us to do away with the distinction between local service and long distance, and to take businesses that had been built around creating sort of separate structures for things that ultimately were the same, the routing of bits, and enabling them to be delivered more efficiently and more seamlessly. So with that, I will turn it back to the committee.
Thank you very much.
I don't really have a whole lot to add to that because I just think it's in specific relation to the existing payments infrastructure. To my earlier comments about EMV and how it relates to mobile and what we've seen a few different starts at mobile payments since around the mid 2000s. Around 2005, 2006 was when some of the first mobile technologies of using your mobile phone in place of your card to make a purchase at the point of sale at the retailer counter really started off, and that was using what we call contactless terminals. So EMV is a contact chip card. You insert it into the terminal to do a transaction. Contactless has radio frequency and the ability for a mobile phone, when it's in that field of radio frequency, to pass very similar information between the phone and the terminal. So that infrastructure exists today. It hasn't been widely invested in on the merchant side because there wasn't a lot of demand for consumers until very recently with Apple Pay. So there's about 500,000 acceptance locations in the U.S. today that can accept contactless payment, which also has some enhanced security to it. It has the ability from a standard to be as strong as the EMV cryptogram, but the merchants need to invest in passing that data on the back end. So mobile payments for Apple Pay, for example, is based many ways on from the physical world interaction of your phone to the terminal on similar technology to EMV. But there's also other payments, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, like in-app purchases where people are making payments that have nothing to do with using your phone in physical contact with a merchant in a store. So the field of mobile payments and the universe of mobile payments is much broader than using your mobile phone at the point of sale. But as it relates specifically to some of the things we're working on at Visa, it's very much related to using your phone much in place of what you do today with a card, but with some enhanced security like biometrics and other ways of authenticating the consumer, as well as masking that card number through using tokenization so that if your mobile phone's ever stolen or somebody intercepts that data out of your mobile wallet, they can't take that data to go create a counterfeit card or to do unverified or fraudulent transactions on the internet, for example.
Any questions from the panel?
Thank you so much for the information. I'm thoroughly being educated today. And when I leave, I'll probably understand how this credit card works. I just wanted to ask the question, and you brought it up last. What if someone steals your phone? And what if you go over to a terminal, and because you have this phone, and you know maybe who you stole it from, what keeps you safe?
Well, go ahead.
Sure. So this is actually a really great question, and it's one of the issues that makes the discussion of the rollout of EMV and the ongoing dispute between retailers and financial institutions about who should bear the cost of payment fraud so fascinating, right? Because the answer is what keeps you as a consumer safe is federal law. The Truth in Lending Act, if you're using a credit card like this one, says that if you haven't authorized the transaction, you cannot be required by the issuer to pay for it. It's implemented under Reg Z and is enforced by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. If you use a debit card, that protection comes from the Electronic Funds Transfer Act and Reg Z, also enforced by the CFPB. Now, Visa and MasterCard have gone past both Reg Z and Reg E in the context of transactions, whether you implement them via mobile device, whether you implement them by the card itself or just the information on top of the card, and said that you as the consumer face no liability in connection with that transaction. That's known as the zero liability protection. And so what that sets up is this fight between, so consumers are not on the hook. So long as they identify the fraudulent transaction on their statement. But what this sets up is this fight between merchants on the one hand and financial institutions on the other about who's going to bear the cost of fraud and when. And so that's what makes sort of sitting in the back of the room and listening to the discussion of EMV so fascinating, right? So Chairman Dabney, you've asked like over and over again, what about online? What about online? Okay, I'm happy to answer that question, right? The answer is nothing. EMV does not change at all the allocation of fraud responsibility for online transactions. And the answer, and the reason why, is because the card network rules assign that liability to the e-commerce merchant. So you could put a chip on every card in the United States, and you could re-terminalize every merchant in the United States, and e-commerce merchants are still going to eat the liability from fraudulent transactions. One. Two, we know historically from having watched the rollout of EMV in other parts of the world that you will experience more fraud on online transactions than you see in brick and mortar post EMV rollout, not because the technology makes the underlying infrastructure less secure, but because if you're going to steal card data and use it to generate a fraudulent transaction, you're going to use that information in an online mode, because in a way, like the introduction of EMV is not really any different than the introduction of the magstripe was 15 years ago. The introduction of the magstripe reduced fraud. Again, this fight between merchants on the one hand and consumers and financial institutions on the other hand. Consumers are on the sidelines and have been since the early 70s. Because it has a data element on the back of the transaction known as CVV2 that is not visible on the card face itself. And so that enables the card networks to identify a transaction that originates with a magstripe as a magstripe transaction at the point of sale. Right? When you do chip EMV, it introduces a new element, this dynamic element that was talked before, but it's just appended to the other 16 digits and the expiration date. And that can only protect in environments where that information field is present. So it's not present when you use your card transaction in an online mode. It's just not. It's a solution to a different problem.
Would the same rules apply to Apple Pay and Google Wallet?
So the answer is, so Google Pay we don't yet know, or I mean Google Wallet we don't yet know how they're going to implement. The answer with respect to Apple Pay is it's a little different because of the core technology that drives Apple Pay and that is super interesting and that hasn't really been talked about here, but I was fortunate enough a couple weeks ago to help a group of students create a conference at UC Berkeley Law School, go Bears, on payments. And one of the gentlemen who had helped to introduce Apple Pay came and, for JPMC, came and spoke about it. And what we talked a lot about in that conversation is tokenization. And we've heard discussion of it here today. So what tokenization does is it creates an alternative to the static 16-digit numbers that you see on the plastic card. And what Apple Pay does is it creates a unique token that corresponds to my card and to my phone. And it's that information that is then used to initiate an online transaction. But it doesn't have anything to do specifically with EMV.
No, but to answer your question, I think earlier, how
So
are
you're
you
off
as
the
a
hook, though.
consumer protected?
Right.
Well, you're also protected in the fact that if your phone is stolen, you have to authenticate yourself to your phone to do a purchase transaction. So if somebody else steals your phone and takes it, if they don't know how to authenticate themselves to your phone, like know your password, or if you're doing biometric authentication, they can't swipe your finger and authenticate themselves to your phone, that application to them is rendered useless. If they can hack into the application and get the account number out of that, it's a tokenized number, as he was mentioning, so that number isn't a number. It's not your same number that's on the front of your card. And so if they try to take it and encode it on a magstripe of like a hotel key or another card, they won't be able to swipe it at a merchant terminal and be able to have that transaction be validated, because the issuer, when they get that authorization message, will say, what is this number? This number doesn't apply to anything other than your mobile phone, and this is clearly coming from a card. It's not coming from your mobile phone. I'm going to decline this transaction. transaction.
Right.
Same thing if somebody tries to type that into the internet and do an online transaction. It's domain specific, meaning it's limited to the domain of your phone, and it's also specific to certain transaction types, like a mobile transaction versus a card transaction versus an internet transaction. So you're limiting the field of use as well as masking the account number by giving it a different number. So you as a consumer are protected in many ways, but also the ability for a fraudster to not necessarily take your phone and commit fraud. There's a lot of different layers of security in terms of tokenization and biometric authentication that are also making that harder for someone to steal your phone and do transactions with it.
But even if they did, even if they took the phone and somehow, let's say, took your password for using it, or found a way to lift the biometric indicator, and so we're able to use the phone to initiate a transaction, you would still be protected as a matter of both federal law and card network rule. So the consumer is not on the hook.
Right.
Any other questions? Mr. Stone?
But at the heart of this, all we're really talking about, I mean, from a user standpoint, is authentication. Because all these other mechanisms are sort of other tools that are sort of built in to either establish or then to act upon that authentication. Are we headed in any new direction with respect to authentication?
I would certainly hope so, which is what makes the whole discussion about EMV rollout like a little odd, right? I mean, EMV is a way of authenticating the card, not the cardholder,
Right.
using 1996 technology.
Right.
Like, there are way better ways to authenticate an individual in today's world. So you can do it biometrically. You can do it. I mean, Apple Watch and other that you can create applications that by proximity authenticate the person. So that, you know, for example, there are some technologies that create sort of a Bluetooth leash between the phone and the computer.
And this, the better we get at authentication, the rest of this stuff goes by the wayside. Because it's not, I mean, and you know, back to your paper money, the only authentication was who's holding it and making that transaction. And so if where technology ultimately comes in is improving the authentication piece, that makes the rest of, and since the laws have in their way artificially or arbitrarily moved the risk from one party to another, and that's what the policy does. And that's sort of our role, is establishing that from a matter of policy, who carries what risk. But the real protection is that authentication piece, which we've only really barely touched on here,
right,
because that's kind of out of our realm here once we've decided who's responsible for what.
Well, but there are ways that it...
Ultimately, that's the most important.
Yeah, there are ways this gets complicated, though. Assemblymember Stone. So, for example, I was involved in litigation for a number of years related to California Song-Beverly Act. And again, this was a question that the chairman alluded to when you enter your zip code at an automatic fuel dispenser, right? So Song-Beverly says that a retailer cannot request or require personal information, and the California Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, who am I to judge, decided that a zip code was personal information. Who knew? There are, I don't know, 25,000 people who live in my zip code, several of whom share the last name Brown, so that doesn't seem to be, you know, too personal an identifier to me. But so if you're going to inhibit the retailer's ability to require personal information for the consumer to authenticate themselves, yeah, law definitely plays an important role. And I'm certain, and indeed the California Supreme Court ultimately concluded this, that when Song-Beverly was enacted, again it's sort of funny how all this comes together, in 1996, I believe, that the internet was, you know, hardly a twinkle in the commercial eye.
Well, right, because that's about who is getting that information that is the authentication. That's really what Song-Beverly is about. But what in the bigger picture, what we're talking about here is that authentication piece that's ultimately authorizing the transaction with wherever that money is coming from.
Right, but if you say that the merchant can't request or require it, that creates some real technical limitations for how you might implement a technology.
Yes, that's true. and that's why hopefully we're constantly sort of updating what we're doing, which we don't always do a really good job at, but just to make sure we're kind of clarifying roles here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
Stephanie, would you like to wrap up? And then before I do, Mr. Brown, if you'd like to stay for our next panel,
Sure.
we'd love to have you as part of that. And Stephanie, before you wrap up, and I know you want to touch on this a little bit, if you could just maybe touch on a little bit some of the trends you're seeing with Apple Pay and seeing how this is kind of affecting your rollout of the EMV and how that'll play within your operations going forward.
Sure. So I think one comment to make is it's not an either or investment in going to mobile or going to EMV. I think there's a layered security approach. And if you look at the rest of the world, there's over 3 billion EMV chip cards around the world and over 50 million EMV merchants. So certainly when our consumers here in the U.S. travel, EMV terminals are what they're interacting with. And when other people travel to the U.S., they're using EMV cards. Investing in EMV for our point of sale here in the U.S. is what helps us protect against counterfeit fraud, which there's 1.2 billion cards in the U.S. today that people are using every day, whereas smartphones are new, and they're certainly something that people are carrying almost all the time, but not everyone has a smartphone and not everyone is using a smartphone to make payments. So I think the emergence of mobile payments is something that's very innovative and something that's certainly increasing, but Apple Pay is something that only certain financial institutions are participating in and only certain consumers are participating in. So we're still in the early days of mobile, and I think that's why it's important to draw that connection that investing in EMV at the point of sale, it brings this data element. We call it field 55 in our network. It's an added field that the merchant needs to send into the network that carries that one-time code. That's also the field we use to pass tokenization data, which is what we use to support innovations like Apple Pay and mobile transaction authentication, for example. So it's important to lay that infrastructure, whether or not somebody's using a card at the point of sale and they're putting it into the terminal as an EMV chip card inserted into the terminal, or whether they're using a contactless enabled card that has a chip that can also do contactless, or whether they're using a mobile phone that has Apple Pay or other types of contactless and NFC equipment enabled on it. So that infrastructure is what we're using as the foundation to bridge us as we start to move to mobile, and it becomes much more ubiquitous as we go forward.
Ms. Erickson, thank you so much for your testimony. Thank you so much for your testimony today on all three of our panels so far. We really appreciate you being here. We also appreciate all our previous speakers taking on to the next panel about tokenization. Kind of leads into the perfect discussion for our final panel, which will discuss the technology and promise of virtual currency. Obviously, Mr. Brown, thank you for staying. We'd also like to welcome up Jerry Brito, Executive Director of Coin Center, Fred Eschrom, Co-founder and President of Coinbase, Chris Larson, CEO of Ripple Labs, Karen Gifford, Chief Compliance Officer of Ripple Labs as well. Thank you for all being here today. And Mr. Brito, if you'd like to start.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Jerry Brito, and I am the Executive Director of Coin Center. Coin Center is a nonprofit research and advocacy center that's focused on the public policy issues facing digital currencies. Our mission is to be a resource to policymakers and members of the media who want to learn more about digital currency technology and to develop legal research that meets policy challenges that this technology presents. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. I'd like to provide some background on the technology that we're discussing here today. I'd also be happy to answer any technical questions that you might have or to explain some of the regulatory activity at the federal level. Now, digital currencies are nothing new. They have existed for decades, from World of Warcraft Gold to Facebook credits to even airline miles. These are online payment systems new. PayPal, Visa, Western Union Pay, these are all examples. So what is it about Bitcoin and similar digital currencies that make them unique? Bitcoin is the world's first completely decentralized digital currency, and it's the decentralized part that makes it unique. Decentralized means that there is no issuer and there's no central authority. There is no company, there is no building, there is no server that runs Bitcoin. Before the invention of Bitcoin, for two parties to transact online, to transact electronically, always required a trusted third party, someone like PayPal or Bank of America. And why was that? Well, what would an online transaction have looked like without a trusted intermediary? Well, we can think about something like cash. A cash transaction has no trusted third party. If I hand you a $100 bill, you now have it, and now I don't. And we can verify that the transaction has taken place by looking at our hands. If we try to do that online, what would that look like? Well, we'd have to represent the $100 bill digitally. We'd have to have a digital $100 file. And so I'd attached a $100 file to a message, much like I might attach a photo or a Word document to an email, and I'd send it to you. You would then have the $100 file, but what about me? When I email you a Word document, is the document deleted from my computer? No. I retain a perfect digital copy of that document. And if it was a $100 file, I would retain a perfect copy, and I could send it then to a second person or a third person. And this is what computer scientists called the double spending problem, which is a very apt name for it. We solved that problem by employing trusted third parties like PayPal. When I send you $100 using PayPal, I don't communicate directly with you. Instead, we each have an account with a third party that we trust, PayPal. And intermediaries like PayPal keep a ledger of account holders' balances. And when I send you $100, PayPal deducts the amount from my account and adds it to yours. Bitcoin's invention is revolutionary because for the first time, the double spending problem is solved without the need for a trusted third party. Bitcoin does this by distributing the necessary ledger among all of the users of the network. It's a peer-to-peer network. Every transaction that occurs in the Bitcoin network is registered in this distributed public ledger, which is called the blockchain. The global peer-to-peer network, composed of thousands of users, takes the place of a single intermediary. You and I can now transact online without the need for a trusted third-party intermediary. And so the question then becomes, why would one use Bitcoin instead of a traditional payment system? And there are many reasons, but chief among them is that because there is no intermediary, transactions costs can be lower, making Bitcoin transactions cheaper and faster than some existing payments systems. Perhaps more importantly, though, Bitcoin allows for new kinds of transactions that were never before feasible, including microtransactions, self-executing contracts, and other innovations. Bitcoin is an open network protocol. This means that unlike PayPal or a credit card network, you don't need permission to join the network and transact. As a result, Bitcoin is an open platform for innovation, just like the internet itself. In fact, Bitcoin looks today very much like the internet did in 1995, or 96 for that matter. Some dismissed the internet then as a curiosity, but many could see that, and because it was an open platform for innovation, you could have world-changing applications be built on top of it. Few in 1995 could have foreseen Facebook or Skype or Netflix, but they could see that all of the building blocks were there for some amazing innovations. Bitcoin is like that today. We can't conceive yet what will be the killer applications, but it's pretty obvious that they will come. Bitcoin faces some challenges, however, and chief among them is regulatory uncertainty, especially at the state level. If we think it back again to the early internet, it was not until the government made it clear that it would pursue a light touch regulatory approach that internet innovation really took off. Bitcoin today is in need of a similar commitment from government. And this is why I applaud your engagement in this issue, and I encourage that as you look at your policy towards this issue, that you consider its effect on innovation. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Mr. Ursem, if you'd like to go next.